Here's a fun story. It's not mine, I just found it on the internet, but it's a good one. So this guy's mother was reading The Exorcist, and finally she'd had enough. She said, "This book is evil, it's terrifying, and I just can't even finish it." She was so scared of the book, she took it and threw it into the lake. So her son dutifully went to the local bookstore and picked up a new copy, ran it under the kitchen sink, and left it on her nightstand. Like I said, not my story, but yeah, that's something I would do. So May of 2023 is officially over, and as usual, it's time for me to discuss all the books I read over the last month. In our latest episode of this particular series, I didn't read quite as many books as I'd been hoping to, but I did make it my goal to make my reading list as odd as possible. It seems like that was a worthy goal, so we're going to keep that up for this month. Very quickly, before I get to reviewing the books, let me just remind you that if you're interested in any of these books that I'm talking about, you'll find purchase links down in the What's It, along with links to all of my other projects. Do be sure also to like and subscribe and all that YouTube-y stuff to help support my work here on this channel. With all of that nonsense out of the way though, let's just get started with the books. First up, as you probably know if you watched April's video, is Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. Because I had started but not yet finished this book at the end of last month. Well, of course, I finished it this month, so that's where we begin. First things first, you need to know this is a sequel. Specifically, it's the second in a trilogy called the Indian Lake Trilogy. And you really do need to read the first book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, before you try to tackle this one. It picks up a few years after the first book left off, and if you don't know the events of its predecessor, you're going to be completely lost trying to follow the characters in this one. And honestly, I doubt there's very much chance of your ever getting completely caught up. But the good news is that the first book was one of my favorite books of a couple of years ago, so reading the backstory, reading that book, isn't so much a chore as it is a treat. But moving on to the new one, with Don't Fear the Reaper, I couldn't wait to dive in and start spending time once again with one of my favorite characters from horror novels of recent years. And in that regard, this book doesn't disappoint. It's really fascinating to see what Jade is up to several years later, how she's changed and how she stayed the same. She remains a remarkable and fascinating character, and if you loved the first book, you're going to love catching back up with her. However, that's where this sequel stumbles just a little bit for me, because I feel like it tried to juggle just maybe a few too many point of view characters. While most of them are interesting, I often found myself wanting to get back either to Jade or to the real action of the book, and some of the chapters just take a little bit too long treating us to the inside of all of the other characters' minds. And like I said, it's not that they're not interesting, it's just that they're not the most interesting thing in the book, at least for me, and I often found myself a little bit distracted by my wish to get back to the things that I most wanted to read about. But on the plus side, if you're as big a slasher fan as I am, and I suspect most fans of the first book are, you will be pleased to know that the author continues in this book to treat us to so many references to slashers, both well-known and obscure, that we immediately know we're in the hands of a true devotee of the genre, and I, for one, still love making all the connections between the book's events and those depicted in some of my favorite horror movies from decades past. Ultimately, I found this book wasn't as good as its predecessor, but I still recommend it, and I will certainly still be looking forward to Volume 3 whenever that comes out. Next up, we're moving on to a book that came out some 20 years ago, and that's Come Closer by Sarah Gran, a short book that provides a rather unusual perspective on the demonic possession story. If you're anything like me, you've probably read your fair share of demonic possession novels or seen your fair share of demonic possession movies. Typically, they seem to follow a fairly standard format. Someone begins to act strangely, modern medicine fails to diagnose the problem, their friends and or family become increasingly concerned, and ultimately an exorcist, invariably from the Catholic Church, is called in to solve the problem. It's a good formula and it works well, but it is a formula. It's refreshing, therefore, to read a demonic possession story that subverts those expectations. Here, we get a story told from the perspective of the individual being possessed. The book is written in the first person and describes what demonic possession feels like from the inside out. It's a unique perspective on the subgenre and offers a lot of opportunity for character study. And perhaps the most important thing is that it's different enough from all the other demon possession stories that the reader never quite knows what to expect, so it manages to keep tension relatively high throughout. However, I think it suffers a bit in its brevity. It is a short book. And while the format offers a lot of opportunity for character development, and the main character is certainly a relatable one, the book's short length means we only see fragments of her life, and I think it could have been strengthened had it taken the time to really let us get to know not only the main character, but also all the other characters whose lives her transformation, shall we say, will affect. That could have really amplified the horror, at least for me. Along similar lines, there are really only a few scenes in the book that truly capture the horror of the character's situation. Some of her actions are described in such a matter-of-fact sort of way that the reader loses some of the horror of the moment. But that's not to say it's poorly written, far from it. Rather, the terse descriptions seem to be an intentional attempt to convey that the demonic possession has dulled the main character's sense of horror, even as she retains her own consciousness. It's effective in that regard, just as the entire book is well written enough to keep the reader engaged and intrigued throughout, but it does ultimately undercut some of the horror from the reader's perspective. At the end of the day, I'm not going to say this is a new favorite book, but I do highly recommend it, particularly if you're a fan of demonic possession stories and you're looking for something that offers a refreshingly unique take on the genre. Next up, we're taking a brief detour from horror novels to discuss a non-fiction book, although I think it's one that will largely appeal to horror readers, and that's The Madmans Library, the strangest books, manuscripts, and other literary curiosities from history by Edward Brooke Hitching. It probably takes a certain kind of bibliophile to want to read a book about books. As it happens, I am just such a bibliophile, and this book is a true delight and has become a new favorite of mine. Though not a complete history of the written word, it does trace much of literary history through its discussions of some of the strangest and most remarkable books ever put into print. Included are tales of lethal books, tiny books, giant books, books bound in human skin, and even some books allegedly written by divine or demonic entities. But it's not just a collection of interesting literary history. It's a remarkable work of literature in its own right, charmingly and humorously presenting its various tales in such a way that the reader can scarcely set the book down until having turned the very last page. And it's also the sort of book to which one will regularly return simply to marvel at the numerous wonderful photographs and illustrations throughout. Indeed, the book itself is a work of art as a physical object, which is as it ought to be since the book's subject matter celebrates books as works of art. This is a perfect book for any lover of history and or of the written word. Horror fans may be particularly interested in the second chapter concerning anthropodermic bibliophagy, or the binding of books in human flesh, or indeed the writing of books in human blood. An interesting side note came up in that chapter concerning the copy of the Quran that Saddam Hussein had written in his own blood. It turns out, the author tells us, that Islamic law prohibits that particular medium for writing the Quran, but also prohibits the destruction of a Quran, so nobody's quite sure what to do with the damned thing. Another chapter deals with books allegedly written with supernatural assistance, certainly of interest to horror fans or those interested in the history of paranormal lore. But it's not all horror either. The book also describes a 37.5 million word diary in which a man kept meticulous records of every event in his life, writing at 5-minute intervals for decades, in the hopes that such a detailed record might be of interest to future scholars. And one of my personal favorites came from a Brazilian tax attorney who, at great personal expense, published a 7.5-ton, 2.1-meter thick, 41,000-page monstrosity containing the entire tax law of Brazil. He did so, of course, in protest of an out-of-control tax code. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention a book that isn't included in the Madmans Library. The American company called the Commerce Clearinghouse publishes a work called The Federal Tax Reporter, which contains the tax law, as passed by Congress, the IRS regulations, and the relevant case law necessary for tax attorneys and accountants to correctly apply the federal tax law in the United States. This document is over 70,000 pages long. Do with that information as you will. But returning to the Madmans Library, yeah, there's really not a whole lot more that I can say, except that it's a truly delightful and charming book, and I think a lot of y'all will really get a kick out of reading it. My next book brings us back to proper horror, and that's a tiny little novella called Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. It's a short book, as you can see. It's the sort you can read in a single sitting, which you'll assuredly do, because once you do start reading, its heartbreaking relentlessness will have you turning the pages until the end. And then it'll continue to haunt you for quite a while after you finish. Not since Stephen King's Pet Sematary have I seen a book that more accurately captures the horror behind the loss of a child or other loved one, and the sense that one would do anything, no matter the cost, to somehow bring that person back. But though the book invokes similar themes as King's work, it's a decidedly different book, so don't think this is just a knockoff. It does share some themes, and it's similarly dark, but Laurel Hightower has created something not quite like any other book I've read. For such a short work, coming in at just over 100 pages, it starts off strong and yet somehow manages to continually raise the tension throughout, building to an Aristotelian, shocking yet inevitable ending. The only flaw, if it can even be called a flaw, is that certain actions by certain characters raise a couple questions of believability, though never truly crossing the line into severely distracting the reader from the book. I struggled to elucidate further because that would involve some major spoilers, but suffice it to say that a couple of scenes raised some questions the book's short length couldn't answer. But this did not detract from my overall enjoyment of the book. If indeed enjoyment is the right word for such a bleak tale. This one won't take much time to read, and it's worth every minute. It may not be for the faint of heart, but if you're looking for something on the heavy and emotional side, you're gonna love Crossroads. The next one I chose was one that's been sitting on my shelf for a year or two, and I'm really happy to have finally gotten around to it, even though it's not anything to do with horror. That's Restitution, Civil Liability for Unjust Enrichment by Ward Farnsworth. Obviously, as I said, it's not horror, so I'll be really brief here. I've read this author before. In fact, I've even mentioned him on this channel before in a very different context. He's a lawyer by trade, but has also written about rhetoric, philosophy, chess, you name it. In this book, he tackles a body of law that overlaps and yet is distinct from both tort and contract law, and it's fascinating. It's not horror, so I won't go into the details, but I'll just say that if you have an interest in law, you'll love this book. And check out the author's other books as well. They're good. While taking a break from horror, I also read this book, The Best of the Best American Science Writing, edited by Jesse Cohen. And again, my review here is going to be brief because it's not horror. What this one basically comes down to is that I did like the book. I am, after all, a science nerd. But I didn't really find it lived up to its promise of being the best of the best, and I found myself wishing for more actual science writing instead of science journalism or writing about the politics of science, and this book is dominated by journalism and political considerations within science. Even still, I did enjoy reading it, though I prefer to get most of my science news just a little bit closer to the source. Getting back to our favorite genre, I read a book the author sent me for purposes of writing a review, so I didn't really know what to expect. That book is Hello Martin by P.J. Burgee. I went into this book blind. I'd never read the author before, and all I really knew was that it was going to be a vampire story. But I'm pleased to report that it really is a lot of fun, and it delivers the kind of vampire I want, not the teenage sparkly kind. The front of the book promises that it'll be a supernatural romance until it's not, and that's exactly what we get. The early chapters do set it up in very much the same way as the vampire romance stories, but by the end we realize, and it's no real spoiler to say so, that the vampires in this world are the way vampires ought to be. Brutal and pure evil. In that way, we get to sort of make fun of the very idea of a romance with a monster such as a vampire. That said, despite the brutality of some of the scenes, it's not too heavy a read. It's fairly light in tone, and it'll please most readers who are looking for throwbacks to vampire novels, or vampire movies for that matter, of decades past. That's not to say it's a perfect book. Some of the dialogue does feel a little bit forced, and occasionally some of the characters' actions strain credulity a bit, but these are relatively minor flaws that don't significantly detract from what's meant to be a quick, fun romp through some vampiric shenanigans. That's all we really need from a book like this, and Hello Martin delivers it very well. Next, we turn to The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Caw. This was one of the Nightworms books from this last month, and again, a pretty short one, coming in at just about 100 pages. It's an author I had heard of, but hadn't read before, so I was excited to try it out, especially since it features a rather horrific mermaid and a creepy plague doctor. Before I read it, I heard this book described as something of a modern and gory or horrific take on a fairy tale. And I was all kinds of excited about that because I think fairy tales are an often overlooked and underrated literary form. And as a horror fan, I was curious to see this supposedly gruesome version of a fairy tale. Unfortunately, though I certainly didn't hate the book, I wasn't quite as impressed as I hoped and expected to be. Let's start by talking about the writing style, because that's something a lot of other reviewers have mentioned, some with praise and others with condemnation. Some reviewers have complained that the writing is perhaps too poetic, that the author uses large words when small ones would suffice, or even that it's pretentious. Arguably, all of those things are true. The book absolutely is overwritten, maybe to the point of pretentiousness. Certainly, it was at least wordy enough that I noticed it while reading. However, that doesn't bother me as much as it seems to bother some people. I can appreciate a poetic style of writing, and though I do think the author occasionally veers toward the pretentious, I found the style mostly to my own liking. But while I don't object to the linguistic style, I do think the writing gets in the way of some of the other elements of narrative. Specifically, the book really lacks any meaningful character development. Even after 100 pages, the main viewpoint character is still fairly alien to me, and the other characters are even flatter. I just didn't find anyone to relate to enough to make me care about what happened in the story. That's not to say I have to like the characters. I don't. But I do have to care about them. And here, I simply didn't find them developed enough to really care one way or the other what happened. The author seemed more interested in telling us what happened than letting us truly experience the events through the characters. The result is a book that's linguistically interesting, but narratively flat. It feels a lot more like a vision out of a nightmare than a coherent narrative. And while I can appreciate that style for the duration of a short story, it becomes tiresome in even a short book like this novella. If any of you saw my 1-minute movie review of Skinamarink, My feelings about this book are similar. I can appreciate the way this author and that filmmaker present a nightmarish vision, but didn't really enjoy working my way through either one, simply due to the format and lack of solid narrative structure. And that brings us to The Case Against Satan, a 1962 demonic possession novel by Ray Russell. My second demonic possession novel this month, for whatever reason. This Penguin Classics version also has an introduction by modern horror maestro Laird Barron, and it's been on my radar for a while, but I finally got around to reading it for the first time this month. And let me tell you, I knew it was going to be a good one just as soon as I read the opening paragraph. I'll go ahead and read it for y'all so you know what I'm talking about. The opening paragraph of the book says, "Perhaps because God has become a nodding Santa Claus with twinkling eyes and a spun-glass beard, or because television spot announcements coo us into worship, or because posters painted by airbrush smoothies and written by slogansmiths assure us that the family that prays together stays together, or because religion has become an unnatural thing of all light and no shadow, a pious bonbon so nice, so sweet, so soporifically bland that a Karl Marx can call it the opium of the people not without justice, or because dread, blood, awe, the sense of primal forces and the element of terror, without which there can be no great love, great art, great faith, have been slowly and systematically subtracted from religion. Perhaps for all or some of these reasons, but more likely for reasons we are not equipped to understand, a priest of the Roman Catholic Church was put on trial one harrowing weekend in the second half of the 20th century." What follows describes the so-called trial of that priest in delightfully intellectual or philosophical terms. It's probably inevitable that this book will be discussed in comparison to a book that came out about a decade later. I refer, of course, to William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. And superficially, these two books are quite similar. They both feature priests engaged in battle against what they presume is a demonic force inhabiting the body of a young girl. Indeed, they were both inspired by some, not all, of the same real-life stories of real-world exorcisms. But despite their similarities, these are two incredibly different works. While The Exorcist leaves little room for doubt that the possession is real, The Case Against Satan is an arguably more nuanced work, spending much of its length describing the philosophical and theological discussions between its various characters as they try to make sense of the situation in which they find themselves. The result is a book that, while still a horror novel, is far less scary and certainly less sensational than The Exorcist, but instead a softer and arguably more intellectual read. But whether you're interested in religious fiction or just looking for a good horror story, it's definitely one that needs to be on your reading list. Sometimes we read horror merely to escape, but The Case Against Satan is a different sort of book. It's the kind we read because it can make us think. And that's what the best of horror ought to do. And that brings us to the present. Once again, I didn't get through quite as many as I'd hoped, but I think I did okay this month. One of the things that's been holding me back a bit is that I've been laying the groundwork for a new business venture. The good news is I'm almost ready to make my formal announcement, and I can guarantee y'all are going to want to know about it, so do be sure to stick around this channel and wait for that news. But until then, I'm going to sign off, so until next time, take care and stay scared.